Greta, grab the rope! Jory, hold on! Greta, are you there? Tom, pull, steady.
Tom jammed his shoulder against brick, felt a plank scrape his back, and coughed as soot rasped his throat. Fear tightened his fingers around the frayed rope and made his jaw ache. He breathed shallow to keep from swallowing the ash. "Hold on, Tom," the foreman said from above, and the rope jerked once. The attic smelled of wet wood and old coal. The light from the lantern pooled on a beam and left the shaft in a hard, soot-streaked dark. Within those first moments the danger was plain. If Tom did not push through, his family would not eat. Fear pushed him forward, and fear shaped every choice he would make that day. He was 12, small in stature and quick at heart, and the narrow flue took his shoulders and left his knees trembling. Tom's hands searched for anything to brace on. He found a protruding brick and dug his nails into it until the skin split. He thought of his mother mending a coat by candlelight, of his sister pressing a bit of bread into his hand before dawn. Those images were not memories in a drifted sense. They were exact movements he could name. The seam his mother stitched, the burnt edge of the bread, the way his sister's thumb smelled of flour. Each image sharpened his jaw. The foreman above grunted and said, "Move, Tom. Debt waits, that was the problem in plain words. A debt owed, work required, danger accepted." They hauled him out with a grunt and a string of curses. Tom lay on the attic boards, coughing until his lungs cleared enough to breathe the lamplight. The foreman's face appeared, angular and impatient. "You owed a cut," he said. "You go back for the old stack, or you sit till winter starves you." Tom pushed soot with the heel of his hand and answered with a short, careful voice, "I'll go." He did not speak about his mother's cough or the coins missing from the market stall. He did not have to. The foreman's words and the debt made the choice for him. Down in the alley, the tavern owner counted empty tankards and closed a ledger with a practiced hand. The tavern owner's counts mattered because he paid wages, and the wages dictated which traps might be bought, which boys might be hired, and which corners of a building were ignored. Greta arrived at the back door with her wicker traps looped on a shoulder strap, and the tavern owner looked up at her with a ledger, scrutinizing frown. "Greta," he said. Without surprise, the council want pay for better traps. "Keep to the old places." Greta set her traps down, kneaded her hands and said, "You paid me last week, Jonas. The cellar behind 3 is worse. They want the chimney cleared and the traps moved. I follow the trail, Jonas." Her words were short pins of complaint. Jonas answered, "I know the trail. I know when coin runs low. You move where I tell you." The exchange finished like that, a short closing of a lid. Greta left with her shoulders pulled back and her jaw set. Her hands smelled of leather and vinegar. Tom climbed again, colder this time. He felt the wind through gaps in the roof as he scaled the ladder and thought of the narrow stack the foreman mentioned. Older, higher, tighter. The ladder creaked. He touched the cap in his pocket, a battered thing with a missing stitch, and pulled it down over his hair. He had learned to move quietly, to breathe between coughs, to keep his fingers from trembling when adults watched. Fear persisted, but now a second motion rose inside him. A steady resignation that had learned its steps. It was visible in the way he set his shoulder, and in the way he listened for the foreman's hand on the rope. Greta followed a rat trail that morning without haste. She crouched to look at scat and disturbed flour, and then ran her fingertips along scuff marks on a stone threshold. Those scuffs spoke. A small animal squeezed through, leaving a smear of grease near the doorframe. Greta's eyes narrowed. She hummed under her breath and slid a small plug of cloth into a trap, checking the wicker loop before she moved on. She found a scrap of cloth tangled in a drain pipe, faded blue, threadbare, and she pocketed it. Tool in hand, she kept records in the calluses of her fingers. Tom's day moved in small urgent motions. He was sent higher into the roof line, where the older stacks breathed cold air and whispered with an older draft. The foreman, whose name was Harrow, watched from a ridge board and barked instructions. "Keep low," Harrow called. "Feel for the crosspiece, then shift left." Tom obeyed. He slipped inside a narrow passage, and his shoulders hit a place that gave a faint, rotten sound. He paused, pressed his cheek against the brick, and tasted iron and rot. That halt was not musings. It was a calculation of danger. He pushed his foot against a soot-covered ledge and moved forward slowly. In the cellar behind the tavern, Greta met the shopkeeper, Mira, who kept a fruit stall and a room for descents. Mira's face showed a worry that had nothing to do with business accounts. "Rats took the last bag of grain, Mira. They left teeth marks in the rope you use for the bell. They exchanged 3 quick lines about times and losses." Greta tightened a strap and said, "I'll watch the rope tonight." "I'll watch it myself." Mira ran a hand across the counter and left a small scrap of saved cloth on the wood. She was asking, without saying it aloud, for protection. These small exchanges became the day's ledger of needs. Tom found the hidden chamber tucked inside the flue, not by chance, but by nail and scrape. He knelt and his hand brushed against a soft object lodged in a corner. A mitten, small and sodden, with a child's stitching showing through the rot. He pulled free the mitten, and beneath it he felt a splintered bone fragment that caught his fingers and made them white with dust. The discovery changed the morning. Tom's breath shortened. He called up into the shaft, "Harrow, there's something here." His voice was thin. Harrow shouted back, "What is it?" The rope above him tightened. Tom's fingers closed around the twin finds, mitten and bone, and he passed them up toward the light, handing them to a hand that was less gentle than he needed. The mitten landed on the attic boards like a small accusation. A pause followed. The attic briefly held a silence of business interrupted. Greta arrived on the roof a short time later because the rat trail had curved up and emptied near the same stack. She crouched under the slate, and her boots left a smear of mud on the beam. She smelled soot and iron, and then saw the mitten on the boards. "That's small." Her voice was steady, practical, but the eyes tightened. "Greta, Harrow," before she could move. "You there for traps or trouble?" Greta did not answer the question directly. She moved to the edge, peered into the flue, and said, "I follow rats. They climb where vermin find shelter. This stack is old. It will give sooner than you think." The words were a warning and a plea folded together. The tavern owner and Harrow argued in the back kitchen later that morning, while Tom sat on the curb holding a small tin of coin that felt like a verdict. "Harrow, if we replace the lining, costs rise. If we send children, coin stays in pockets. It's how things run." Jonas leaned back and flicked ash into a tray. "You know the Council 1T press. They never press where coin is thin. We keep our heads down. You keep them moving." The exchange became sharper. Greta barged in, voice hard. "Jonas, Harrow, you block traps, you cut wages, and you blame boys for the work." There followed 3 quick back and forth lines. "Greta, Harrow, we pay you for results." "Jonas says he pays." Greta replied, "We pay less and ask more." "Jonas." The argument cooled into a tug of ledger and conscience. Tom watched, the coin small in his palm. He nothing. His chest rose with a tight breath. The room smelled of stew and vinegar and a woman's shawl. The point of the argument was clear. Owners protected profit. Workers protected survival. Harrow punished a missed quota by sending Tom into the oldest stack at afternoon. Tom readied himself with a rope, a small satchel, and the foreman's clipped instructions. The stack's mouth was thin. His shoulders scrubbed soot as he squeezed through. The interior was higher than the last shafts, the bricks brittle and the mortar flaking under pressure. Tom moved carefully, but the old bricks shifted with a dry, brittle sound. He felt a tremor in the wall, and put both palms flat to steady himself, then slipped and his knee hit a lending stone. A pebble fell and rattled down into a deeper darkness. That small sound traveled like a warning. Inside the cavity Tom found more than soot. He found a cramped hollow with old rotted tools, a child's broken spoon, and a scrap of paper that had been pressed and creased so many times its writing faded. He picked up the spoon and its handle came away in his hand. His throat closed. The air in the pocket tasted stale and old. He called up, "Harrow, this place has been used. Someone's been hiding here." The word hidden turned the day sideways. He set the broken spoon on his knee and brushed dust into the satchel. Greta crawled down into the same chamber from above because the rat trail had carried her scent to a crack in the flue. She slid into the hollow and found Tom sitting with the broken spoon. Her boots left a slit of light on the bricks. Greta reached out, took the mitten Tom had kept, and turned it over with fingers that had handled animals and traps for years. This mitten is newer than the tools. This child was here later than the rest." Tom tightened his grip on the satchel. The discovery changed the tone between them. Both had been acting under a thin, constant pressure, Tom out of fear of hunger, Greta out of a steady duty to clean up what others let go. Now a darker curiosity opened. They argued in short, sharp lines about what to do. "Tell Harrow," Tom, "tell the tavern owner," Greta countered. They traded 3 fast exchanges. "Tom, tell him now," Greta urged. "Harrow will bury it." "Tom, then we keep it from him," Greta. Before they could agree, the flue made a brittle, settling groan. A band of bricks loosened near Tom's shoulder, and the old mortar crumbled like thin crust. The sound came without fanfare, but with a certainty that made both of them still. Tom felt a rush of cold air and then a grinding shift. Dust fell into his hair. The pocket above them loosened. Greta reached and grabbed for the beam. Tom braced his feet and pushed upward. The collapse began as a small cascade. A brick gave, then another, and then the flue yielded with a wet, clattering noise as soot and broken mortar poured down. Tom shouted and the rope jerked hard. Harrow and Jonas were on the roof in seconds and neighbors gathered with lanterns and curtains thrown wide. The collapse pinned Tom's leg and buried his satchel under a slanted brick. He felt a sharp pain and smelled the metallic tang of blood and old coal. Fear returned, jagged and bright, and Tom's hands went to the wound without thinking. Greta did not freeze. She shouted instructions. "Lift here. Push there. Hold the lantern." Her voice cut through the panic with the same plain authority she used to set traps. Harrow barked orders, Jonas fumbled for crowbars, and Mira ran to fetch water. The neighbors came with hands that gripped and pulled. A child's belt and a baker's apron were used to form temporary slings and ropes. The air filled with the sounds of effort. Wood scraping, men grunting, a woman's breath hitched. The rescue became a physical conversation of pulling and coaching. Tom bit down on a strip of cloth as they shifted the bricks. Pain shot up like fire, but he kept counting pushes in his head to stop panic from taking him. Greta's calloused fingers reached into the gap and found his ankle, then found the satchel. "Tom, can you move?" she asked. He hissed and pushed with his shoulders. "Someone lift now!" And the team hived. The sudden give released a cascade of dust and a small piece of pottery that clattered onto the boards. Tom slid free with a grunt and a curse. He lay on the roof as they pulled him out, and his leg hung awkwardly. It was bruised and bleeding but not broken. The crowd egg-shelled in a long, collective noise. Tom tasted metal and wet cloth. His hands shook. His voice came out in low, short replies when Harrow demanded to know if he could continue work. Tom only looked at the mitten, then at Greta, then at the broken spoon in his satchel. Harrow tried to impose a hush. "Keep this quiet," he said. "There's talk enough without trouble." Jonas shifted his weight and glanced at his ledger as if the day's balance might judge him. Greta looked at Harrow with an expression that did not soften. She set down her traps and said, "You can tea-bury what a child carried out of a chimney." Her voice held the steady patience of someone who had watched disease and loss and learned to name them. A neighbor, Mira, put a rough hand on Tom's shoulder. "We will see the priest and the council, if need be," she said. Harrow's jaw tightened. He answered with one clipped sentence. "Don't teen make trouble." The words were a command and a threat braided together. Greta kneaded a bit of cloth against Tom's calf and said, "Tom, you went where they sent you. That does not mean they can close eyes now." Tom nodded once. He did not speak about the coin in his pocket, but he tightened his fingers around it and then let them fall open. In the quiet that followed, as lanterns were put out and the street returned to its slow breathing, Tom and Greta made a small vow that was not sung or declared but fixed in action. Greta bent and picked up the mitten, smoothing its sodden shape with her thumbs. Tom set the broken spoon beside it and wrapped the satchel straps together. They spoke in short sentences about where to hide the finds until they could be shown without letting Harrow or Jonas disappear them. They planned a visit to Mira in the morning and a quiet conversation with a shopkeeper who might know names. The exchange was practical. Actions and decisions, not speeches. Before the neighbors drifted away, Harrow snapped one order with a softer edge. "See him home." "No work tomorrow until morning." His tone implied a caution as much as command. Greta answered with a single, steady line. "We want to leave him alone." The promise was a small human contract. The final moments of the night settled on a concrete, visible beat. Tom stood under the lamppost with his leg bandaged by Mira and his cap folded in his hands. Greta placed a wicker trap on the pavement beside him and set a small brass whistle on top. It glittered faintly in the lamplight. Harrow walked away with his ledger tucked under an arm. Jonas went back inside, the tavern door closing with a dull thud that sounded like a period placed on a sentence. Mira lifted a small cloth-wrapped parcel and handed it to Tom, a piece of bread and a strip of dried meat. Tom looked at the bread, then at the mitten and spoon in Greta's satchel, then at Harrow's retreating back. He tightened his fingers into a fist and let them fall open. Greta tapped the whistle with 2 quick fingers, a small, definite sound. They left the scene in a line. Greta first, Tom limping but steady, Mira beside them. The lamplight slid across cobbles. The tools leaned against the lamppost where no one would immediately take them. The street kept its quiet. The rescue had ended the immediate danger, but the finds, the mitten, the bone, the broken spoon remained. The chapter closed on that visible fact. The tools and the evidence resting under lamplight, waiting for who would claim them next. Greta set the whistle in her palm and said, "Tomorrow we go to the shopkeeper." "We do this right." Tom nodded, and his voice came out in a small, sure line. "I will come." The street held their shapes as they moved away, and the lamppost showed the small pile of objects that would force choices in the days to follow. A plank cracked beneath Tom's boot and the scaffold tipped. He hit the narrow yard shoulder first, breath leaving him in a small, tight cry. "Tom!" "Hold on!" called the foreman from above. Fear tightened Tom's fingers on the frayed rope as dust and loose mortar rained down. The chest pain from the fall burned along the line where he jammed his shoulder against brick weeks before. Suits still scarred the back of his throat from earlier climbs and made each inhale taste of coal. The collapse made the central danger clear at once. The work was failing them, and the streets were failing too. Greta shoved through the crowd at the lane's edge and knelt where Tom lay. She smelled wet wool and old leather when she stooped. "Tom, easy." "Greta." Her voice was low. She checked his ribs with one firm hand, then glanced toward the bakery door where damp straw and a ladder leaned. She used her shoulder to push a loose plank aside, exposing a shallow hole where water had pooled. Tom flinched and tried to sit. Fear kept his jaw tight, and the memory of earlier pain slowed his movements. The town's urgent problems, unsafe scaffolds and something worse below the streets, were no longer rumors. The foreman climbed down with a lantern swinging from his wrist. He inspected the broken scaffold without touching Tom. "How many chimneys left?" he asked. The question came not with care but with a ledger's economy. 3. Tom drew a breath. He spat a little soot onto his palm. His voice was small. Fear pushed him to answer quickly. Lost wages meant empty bread at home. The foreman looked at his boots, not at Tom's face. "Get up when you can. No work, no pay, you hear?" he said. The words made the choice plain: rest and hunger, or pain and pay. Greta folded her hands over Tom's shoulder. Her mouth pressed into a line that did not soften. "Not tonight," she said toward the foreman. "He fell from your rig. You want him paid, you fix the rig," the foreman snorted. A few townsfolk who had stopped clearing their own nets watched the exchange with hushed interest. Tom's gaze flicked between the men. The fear in him shifted for a moment into a tight, ashamed anger. He could feel the ledger of his obligations adding another line. They moved Tom into the shelter of a lamplit arch, while someone fetched cloth to bind his shoulder. Jory, the street urchin who had been loitering near the bakery, hovered at the edge. He kept one hand on his cap as if to steady himself. "Jory, fetch the rope." "Greta, help him sit up." Jory obeyed with quick, nervous steps. The child's small actions gave the scene an odd order. A tired boy, a practical woman, and a foreman who counted wages faster than bones. Once Tom's arm was bound, the foreman rubbed his chin and pulled a folded notice from his coat. "The magistrate posted a new demand tonight," he said, reading aloud. "Bounty for vermin, visible results wanted. Pay will follow." The implication shifted the scene. Tom's fear became a calculation. If the town paid for rats removed, then catching vermin could be another way to fill pockets. If the magistrate expected results, pressure would grow on the people who worked the streets. Greta's eyes narrowed at the notice. She folded her lips around her judgment. "Greta," she said to no one in particular, and then to Jory, "You heard that. Keep your ears open." She looked at Tom. "If the magistrate wants results, I'll take the lane by the privies tonight. You rest." Tom rubbed his temple. The fear in him folded into a sense of duty. He knew the ledger of his household debts. He also remembered cold rooms and a small sister who woke shivering. "I should go, Tom." He pushed on the bandage with a hand that trembled. Greta stopped him with a steady hand at his elbow. "Not yet. You come if you can climb. If not, you stay. I don't want you risking a fall for coin." Her voice softened for the first time. Tom looked at the ground. He remembered the scrape of a plank from a previous job when he had jammed his shoulder against brick and coughed as ash rasped his throat. The memory was concrete. The taste of ash, the scrape along the back, the foreman's sharp word. He had been afraid then, too, but he had climbed again. The memory pushed him now toward a decision. They left the foreman's lanterns by the doorway and walked under a low arch into the market square. A wind drove rain in thin sheets and carried the smell of spilled stew from a tavern. A town notice board stood lit by a guttering lamp. People clustered near it, their coats damp. Greta slipped through and read the magistrate's notice herself. She tapped the paper with a collused fingertip. "Bounty for each rat taken. Evidence required. Magistrate demands visible proof." The rule turned a nuisance into public business. People muttered that a bounty meant more traps and more men in the sewers. A woman near the board hissed, "If the magistrate wants rats gone, he can fix the drains." "Not us," another man spat into the puddle. Their anger hung in the lane like steam. Greta heard it. She knew how anger could be redirected toward those who caught vermin, toward sweepers and night workers. The magistrate's demand would raise not only rewards but hostility. That calculation shifted the tone from practical to political. They had no time for argument. While following a faint trail of droppings and disturbed straw, the group discovered a collapsed privy in a narrow alley. Rats streamed from the mouth of a drain in a black, quick ribbon and disappeared into a narrow service tunnel. Jory pointed with a shaking finger. "They come from there," he said. His breath puffed out like a small cloud. The sight made both Tom and Greta still. They watched the animals slip like living threads into the dark. The discovery widened the problem. The infestation was connected below the streets, not isolated in one yard. Greta crouched and peered down the drain. Her hands searched the rim for footing and found a rotten rope ladder snagged in the broken wood. She pulled at the ladder and felt it break loose with a wet, racking sound. A scrap of paper fluttered out and landed on the cobbles, a small droplet, stained ledger page. Greta picked it up with 2 fingers and read the inked scrawl. Names, dates, and notes about kitchen waste marked a merchant's name and a back cellar. She felt her face tighten. The ledger contained a deliberate trail of discarded refuse. The infestation shifted from misfortune to negligence. Greta, Tom, his voice thin, who wrote that? He watched the ink as if it might move. Jory pressed closer, that sold Ward Smark near the dock. Jory, he had the quick, factual voice of a child who survived by watching. The new information sharpened into a betrayal. Someone had been dumping food where the drains led, inviting vermin in. They went to the sheltered yard behind the merchant's shop and found a rotted ladder leading to a cellar hatch. 2 hired men blocked the gate when they approached. "We have no business here," one guard said, stepping forward with a club half hidden in his hand. "This yard is private property." His tone was flat and meant to halt them. Greta set the ledger on the low wall and folded her arms. Tom, Jory back a step. "I speak." Her body braced like a gate. The tension rose into the hands of the men and the set jaw of Greta. "Greta," the merchant said from behind the guards, his voice sharp from the upper window where he leaned on the sill. "You never liked business that worked. Keep your traps and leave my yard." He named her by her trade as if that made her a lesser person. Greta did not answer with words at first. She measured the guards' stances and the merchant's feet against the sill. Then she stepped forward. "Merchant, your ledger shows you direct kitchen waste to the cellar drain." "Greta." Her voice was deliberate. "Rats come from there. Children and sweepers get hurt. What you propose?" The merchant's mouth hardened. He shifted his weight. "My cellar is my business," he said. "Do not make trouble." The guards moved a step to the side to block anyone passing. "There'll be no meddling here," one guard added. Tom's fear changed into a quiet heat. He looked at the ledger, then at the man. "You send waste into the drain. Tom, you bring the rats to our street." His words were short. The merchant answered with a hand motion and a flat, legal rebuttal. The exchange became a shove of power, jobs and lives against the merchant's profit. The confrontation tightened. Voices rose in a quick cluster. "Tom, step back," Greta ordered. "Greta, show them the page," Jory urged. The back and forth quickened with 3 short lines as each attempted to push the other into clarity. The guards pushed. Tom's hand moved to the rope at his belt. He did not plan to strike. His body had learned the language of working hands. Grip, pull, steady. The merchant's hired men shoved again and things tipped. Jory darted to block a boot and found himself under a swinging arm. A crate upset and in a spray of wet straw Jory tumbled toward the cellar hatch. There was a sound, a small collapse, and then a deeper, raw noise as rotten supports gave way. For a second the yard seemed to tighten into a single mechanical failure. Jory slid through a gap and then disappeared from the open hatch into the muck below. A rat squealed near Jory's fall. Greta lunged. Her body moved before she thought. She pushed the guards aside with one shoulder and reached into the hatch. The smell of wet rot hit her. She heard Tom curse and then shout, "Jory!" The shout was a physical thing, sharp and immediate. The fear that had governed Tom's choices earlier expanded into frantic action. Greta felt for the child's shoulder with hands gone slick from muck. The crawl space was narrow. The tunnel held a smell of old food, urine, and damp wood. She could hear the rats shuffle like dry leaves. She forced her body forward, elbows scraping against the packed dirt. Her breath condensed on the low stone roof. She found Jory half buried in a slump of muck and a jammed boot. His eyes were wide. He whispered, "Greta." The single name acted like a lever in her chest. Tom worked the rope from above. He fed it down with hands that shook. "Tom." Pull, Greta ordered, her voice cut through the close dark. Tom wrapped his arms around a beam and set his feet. He pulled with the steady effort he'd used on chimneys and ropes. The fear in him morphed into a precise strain. His muscles took orders without thought. Tom, on my mark, Greta. Jory coughed and the rats pressed nearer. The rats' movement pushed air and fell against their skins like a living current. The tunnel shifted and then collapsed further. A loosened stone slid and struck Greta's shoulder. Dirt rained onto Jory's face. Greta's mouth filled with grit. For a moment she could not see. The taste of iron and wet loam filled her. She forced one arm under Jory's ribs and hived. The rats crowded at the opening with quick, greedy noises. Tom! More! Greta barked. Her hands clenched under Jory so hard her knuckles whitened. Tom hauled until his shoulders burned. Jory's boot came free with a wet pop. He slid into Greta's arms like a small, muddy sack. She rolled and coughed, dragging him out under a dim strip of lantern light. Both of them came up breathing, their clothes heavy with muck. Neighbors leaned in from the yard edges, and one called for water. The magistrate's warrant would not be solved by this single rescue, but the act changed how the group saw their job. The immediate danger, Jory trapped in muck and rats, was solved with a raw, physical rescue. The emotional movement carried 3 clear shifts. Fear to resolve for Tom, suspicion to anger for Greta, and alarm to protective action for the neighbors. Those movements had squeezed decisions out of them. At dawn they rested on the cobbles near the collapsed privy. Tom sat on a low step and turned the ledger page in his fingers until the edge was soft. Greta stood, dripping, with a trap slung over her shoulder. Jory sat and cleaned his cap with a shaking thumb. A neighbor brought warm broth in a chip bowl and handed it to Tom. He drank slowly. The quiet was not peace. It was the moment after a storm when hands tremble and people count what remains. Greta unwound the ledger and pointed to the merchant's entries for kitchen waste dates. He did this for months, she said. Her voice held a hard, careful calm. That ledger proves intent. We can press the magistrate. Tom nodded once. He set his jaw and felt a tired steadiness under the old fear. The choice to act had changed his posture. He reached out and put the ledger into Jory's small, muddy hands. Keep this safe, he said. That evening, under a single street lamp, a small circle gathered at a huddled doorway. Neighbors came with wrists rubbed raw from shovels and with traps. The foreman came with an expression that had shifted from annoyance to calculation. The magistrate's edict had changed who would walk the lanes by night. Greta laid the ledger on the step and pushed it forward. We take this to the magistrate tomorrow morning, she said. We demand the drains be cleared. We demand safe scaffolds. We demand he hold the merchant to account. Tom watched faces around the lamp. Some looked eager, others wary. The ledger made the issue concrete. A neighbor named Elsie spoke up. We will go with you, Greta. I will speak for the children who cannot be here. Her voice trembled at first and then steadied. The foreman muttered, if this goes badly, I'll do what I must for my men. The exchange turned into a short negotiation of needs and risks. Safety for work, proof for claims, and wages for families. The rapid back and forth contained 3 quick lines that pushed the plan forward. Greta folded her coat tighter and stared at the ledger one last time. She then took a small slip of paper, wrote 2 names on it, and handed it to Tom. Go see Father Mullen in the morning. He owes you a favor for cleaning his flue last winter. Tom took the paper without speaking. The gesture was clear. Enlist a known ally, gather witnesses, carry the ledger. The solution required practical steps rather than speeches. The group dispersed with a fragile order. Tom walked with Jory for a while, his steps slow and precise. Jory in a small voice, will they pay you now, Tom? Tom paused and looked at the child's boots. Maybe, he said, but we did what mattered. You walked out of that hole. That's what I count tonight. The reply carried tired relief and a new, steady resolve that came from acting rather than waiting. Before they broke apart, Greta slipped the ledger into a sealed cloth and then slid it into the lining of her satchel. She did not speak of consequences. Her hands were steady. The night had pushed her through fear and into deliberate risk. Her choices had pulled a child from the muck and revealed a road toward a public challenge. For now, the town had proof. The ledger moved from a damp scrap on the street to a tool they could use. At dawn the lamplight faded to grey, and the first town bell began to toll. Greta and Tom stood in a small cluster beneath the lamp. They did not speak long. Greta took a breath and said, "Tonight we press the magistrate. Bring witnesses. Bring evidence. Bring the ledger." Tom tightened his hand around the scrap of paper with Father Mullen's name. He looked once at the collapsed privy, and then ahead at the magistrate's house across the square. The chapter closed on a single, deliberate act. Greta slid the ledger under the magistrate's door and stepped back, waiting for whatever answer would come next. The night's events resolved the immediate danger and set the community on a new course. The scaffold that had fallen, Jory's rescue, and the ledger were not an ending. They were a necessary, concrete beginning to a civic claim. The last concrete beat is simple and direct. Greta's hand on the magistrate's door and the ledger placed beneath it. An action that turns private risk into public business and forces the next choice onto someone in authority. The small group left the square with wet boots and tired hands, each carrying a practical change to pursue. Greta shook Tom by the shoulder until his cheek scraped the course rope and he spat soot into his palm. Fear tightened in Tom's throat. The rope under him hummed and frayed. He opened one eye, then the other, and tried to count the breaths that did not belong to sleep. Tom, wake, Greta low and hard. Her fingers pressed against his ribs. Within those first breaths the problem was clear. The rope had been cut, not by wear alone but by small, deliberate bites. Tom blinked away the sleep and felt the rope fibers slip like loose teeth under his palm. The alley below still smelled of smoke and old bread. The flue above sent a thin ember down where it struck a tarred knot and hissed. Greta pulled him upright. She set her boot on the rope and tested the anchor where it looped round a flue pipe. "It won't hold long," she said. Her voice carried no flourish, it carried a ledger. Wages, mouths, winter. Tom pushed soot from his cheek with the back of his hand and answered with something that was half a promise and half a question. "Greta, they'll not pay if I don't stay." That line, wages or danger, stated the conflict that would not leave the block all morning. Tom's fear, the chapter's central compulsion, guided his choices. He had been caught between hunger at home and the snap of a rope for months. In previous weeks he had already slipped on a shaky scaffold and tasted mortar in his throat. The foreman's shout had pulled him clear then, and the bruise along his hip still ached when he climbed. This morning changed nothing about the stakes and everything about the method. Greta's hands were rough with many small repairs. She ran a thumb over the frayed tarred strand and found teeth marks and mouse droppings nested in the twist. "Rats," she said, and spat to wash the word out. She held up a strand and let the light show through where the interior core had been gnawed thin. The discovery shifted the scene. It did not feel like chance. The neighborhood's neglect and a rat problem had become a weather that wore at rope and life alike. "Mrs. Halloway will hear this, Tom," and he tried to make his voice steadier than it felt. Greta glanced along the ridge. Mrs. Halloway stood in her doorway below, shawl tight, eyes like a ledger page. She had watched the children on ropes for years and kept a bowl of starch at the curb for patched socks. "Get down," she called. Loud enough to make the foreman look up where he leaned on the chimney lip, ledger in hand. The foreman stepped forward, a man whose smile had become a contract. He held a list and the habit of counting names before coin. "That boy is paid to sleep there," he said, and his voice tried to be small and final. "We have work. Debts must be settled." Greta's jaw tightened. Her face showed a line Tom had seen before, when she had settled a rat trap, when she had bartered for sacks of onions. That line meant a plan forming. She did not speak the plan. She began moving. Greta grabbed a spare coil of rope from her satchel. Two neighbors, Mrs. Halloway's son, Peter, and old Isaac from the ground floor, had come up the alley after hearing the commotion. They climbed with careful hands, carrying a brace of poles and a second rope. They set themselves where they could anchor a new line. The foreman watched, mouth a thin seam. "Tom, you can wake and walk across the new line if we finish fast." Greta. Her hands did not tremble. They worked, or you get down. She kept her words short because any long sentence could become bargaining. Tom pushed himself upright and tested his balance. His hip stung where the scaffold had thrown him 2 chapters ago when a plank gave and he landed on uneven stones. He tasted old salt in his mouth and counted the holes in his shirt to steady himself. The memory of that fall threaded into his choice now. He could not say, simply, that he was brave. Hunger had made him patient. Fear had taught him to trade safety for coins. The neighbors worked quickly. Peter lashed a new line while Isaac braced the anchor. "Mrs. Halloway watched from the yard and shouted instructions, her voice brittle with a lifetime of giving orders and not receiving much thanks. The foreman stepped closer and said, "You stop that. We move on schedule." He held up the list like a shield. Greta answered him. "He can to sleep on a rope that rats chew," she said. "Tom falls and you take his pay." "That is not my doing." The foreman replied, "You know the rules. Names and hours." The exchange sharpened. That was the first emotional shift, from fear to anger. Greta moved with the anger of someone who had had enough of small harms. She kicked a coil of rope toward the foreman and let him deal with the sight of it. Tom watched the two of them and felt his resolve fracture. He wanted the coin. He did not want to be hauled down with soot in his eyes and a broken arm. "Foreman," Mrs. Halloway called. "You promised pay at Friday, and you still owe Jan. You promised coal last winter, and we only got ash." Her voice piled names and dates like evidence. The foreman's smile thinned. He counted out loud, not in math but in habit, and he named days and tasks as if they absolved him of culpability. Peter pushed his hands into the rope and tested the knots. "This will hold for a crossing," he said, "if we tie proper. He can get across and sit there until we redone." His words tried to make danger tolerable. Greta crouched near the flue and peered into the mouth where soot darkened brick. The flue smelled of old fires and animal fat. A small rat nest had been tucked into a seam where tar had pooled and hardened. She set her hand over the nest and felt the brittle-worn fibers of a rope where rats had gnawed. She pulled free a tangle of hair and twigs. "They've been at the anchor for weeks," she said. "Not a single repair since winter." The reveal landed like a struck match. Neighbors murmured. The foreman turned a face like a ledger page that had been creased. He stepped back from the visible ruin and counted names on his list again. But the counting no longer soothed the smell of char and the sight of wood eaten from within. Greta's plan accelerated. She motioned for Tom to move and for Peter to finish the splice. The coil was almost ready when a glowing ember spat from the flue and struck the tarred patch where the new rope lay. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a thin curl of smoke appeared and heated the tar until it softened and ran like dark syrup. That smoking sliver became the mini cliffhanger that stopped the block fire. Someone shouted, and the shout cut the air so quickly that it left no time for slow thought. Tom's heart leapt into a panicked rhythm. This was the second emotional shift, anger, steady heat giving way to sudden terror. The neighbors moved with directions shouted in short lines. "Drop the coil." Peter barked. Peter tossed the loose rope away and dived for a bucket. Greta grabbed the tarred patch and tried to smother the ember with her sleeve. The foreman shouted instructions and then tried instead to bark at witnesses. Mrs. Halloway ran to a bench and fetched water in a tin mug. Hands reached for shovels and blankets. The alley filled with action. No one stood still. Tom felt his legs go weak. He saw the rope moan under a child's weight and heard a sharp snap that made the air cut. The hastily retied line slacked where the knot had not held, and the rope beneath Tom split like a seam. For a second he hung above a narrow yard and smelled smoke up close. The rope gave beneath him. He fell. The fall was not elegant. He hit the edge of the yard shoulder first, and dirt bit his palms. He cried out once, and the breath left him in a thin sound. A wicker trap, thrown by Greta without time to aim, caught the sleeve of his jacket and jerked him so that neighbors could pull him the rest of the way. Hands dragged him away from a spreading seam of embers seeping along tar. "Tom!" Greta cried, "Hold on, Tom!" Her voice slotted into his head like a peg. He found a grip on the yard stones and let neighbors haul him. "Mrs. Halloway grabbed his chin and checked for broken bone with fingers quicker than pity. The foreman stood back, face gray with a ledger finally unhelpful. He raised his list and his voice faltered. "I told you." Peter spat, "US wages, not safety." He jabbed a finger at the foreman. For a moment the foreman looked like a man caught in the wrong column of his account book. Tom coughed and the taste of smoke turned his mouth bitter. His shoulder hurt where a splinter had kissed his skin. He breathed shallow and counted the number of people watching him. Greta, Mrs. Halloway, Peter, Isaac, the foreman, 2 neighbors who had climbed with tools. The crowd made the incident public. That shift changed the power in a small way. The foreman's bargaining had always relied on privacy, on the lonely choices of children. Now the community had witnessed the cost. A rapid exchange followed, short lines and heated, "You owe him pay, Mrs. Halloway. He fell on your watch. He was paid to sleep there," the foreman said, and then he tried to soften the edges. "This is how it is done. We pay. They work. We would get coal," Peter answered. "You still owe Jan's family a shilling. You promised Mrs. Halloway a new binder for her boy. There is a list, yes, but there is also a burning rope." He paused and shoved the list back at the foreman. The foreman swallowed and counted aloud the names and days on his list, but neighbors interrupted him with facts. Unpaid coins, missed repairs, nights they had watched children sleep on lines and woken to a smell of tar. The argument lasted only minutes, but it shifted weight. The foreman tried to regain control with a raised voice, but the tally of small harms had grown visible. Greta knelt beside Tom and found the sore on his shoulder where a sliver had bitten. She tore a strip from her scarf and pressed it over the skin. "Hold still," she told him. "How long can you work like this?" Tom's voice was rough. "As long as they pay," he said. Then, quieter, "until the rent is done. Until dinner is bread again." He did not add more because there was no need. The ledger of his family, mother thinner since the cold, sister with one shoe, hung in the air. The third emotional shift arrived. Fear, then anger, then wary acceptance, and the first flicker of resolve. Tom sat up and tried to stand. His knee buckled. Isaac steadied him by an elbow. Neighbors argued about the foreman's responsibility. Mrs. Halloway insisted on a public tally of unpaid coins. She pulled a small slate from her apron and started writing names and amounts while people added to it. The foreman tried to object, and then turned color as each unpaid promise was named. The list grew into a proof that could no longer be ignored. "You will pay for the rope, Mrs. Halloway." She was not asking, "You will pay what you owe, and you will help fix that flue. Do not tell me you cannot. If you cannot, tell me why." The foreman stared at the slate as if it were a new kind of law. He bent his head and, for the first time that morning, cleared his throat. "I can give a coin now," he began. "I can promise." Greta cut him off. "We need tools and tar and a proper anchor. Not promises. Tar pays when it keeps a child safe." She kept her voice measured. Words like hammer blows. The crowd's attention sharpened. The foreman counted aloud. He produced a small handful of coins and pushed them into Peter's palm. The coins clinked like a small, inadequate apology. Peter put them into Mrs. Halloway's palm, and she tucked them into her apron with the same quick movement she used to hide teacups from creditors. Greta organized the repair. She called names and gave clear tasks. Isaac braced the anchor. Peter, take the spike. Tom, hold the spare line steady while I splice. She used short commands. People obeyed because she moved like someone who both asked and expected. While they worked, Tom's mind turned inward in the only way he allowed. Plan. He watched Greta knot, and his earlier fear hardened into a kind of calculation. He would keep earning the coins that fed his family, but he also began to store ideas, small ways to change the ledger. The thought was not romantic. It was practical and thin with the grit of daily life. He would ask Mrs. Halloway for extra work. He would wake earlier to sweep more chimneys on his own when foreman lists were short. He would cut fewer corners on safety when he could barter for proper rope. The repair itself nearly failed. The newly spliced line held for a test step, then snapped an inch at the knot where the tar had soaked. Someone pushed an extra rap, and Greta ground a bit of pitch into the splice with her knife to stiffen it. Flames smoldered near the old tar patch, and Peter beat at them with a wet cloth until they went out in a plume of steam and soot. Tom watched each motion with a clarity that had not been possible while he sat asleep on a rope. He tasted coal dust and determination. The crowd's anger cooled into a different energy, cooperation. Hands that had been used to arguing now steadied planks, unrolled rope, and set a block and pulley. The foreman, who had wanted to preserve distance, found himself carrying a plank. He did not protest. He handed it to Isaac with a stiff face and a groaned apology that had the shape of a promise. As the day progressed, neighbors passed tools and counted stitches in the new splice. Mrs. Halloway measured the anchor and declared it sound. The community had not triumphed over the foreman. It had done something more practical. They had taken a moment of exposed harm and turned it into labor paid by small coins and effort. For a while, that was enough. Tom sat on the yard step and felt the bruise along his hip sting when he moved. He ate a crust of bread Mrs. Halloway offered and chewed steadily. Mrs. Halloway propped a flagon of weak tea beside him. "You will not sleep up there again tonight," she said. "Not if I can help it." Her tone was not sentimental. It was managerial. That suited Tom better than pity. Greta tightened the last knot and tested the line with her full weight. It held. She glanced up and found Tom watching. She nodded once and offered a hand. Tom took it and let her haul him to his feet. He tested the repaired line with a cautious step. "Try it, then sit where we can reach you," she said. The foreman approached with a small, begrudging expression. "I will add 1 coin to his pay for today," he said. His mouth would not shape apology. The coin was the thing he could do. He turned to leave with his list. Mrs. Halloway caught his arm. "You will also bring tar and a new coil of rope by morning," she said. "And you will note Jan's shilling." Her voice left no room for ledger excuses. The foreman nodded, the motion of a man who had agreed to terms publicly. He left with a promise, and the promise moved through the alley like a visible thing. After the repairs, the block settled into a tired motion. Children watched from windows. A kettle in a kitchen below sang weakly. Tom sat with a hand on his shoulder and felt the bruise, the ache, and a resolve that was not grand but steady. He would keep working. He would not sleep on the rope again if he could help it. He would try to buy better rope with the next coin. Greta lingered. She checked knots, tightened a splice once more, and then handed Tom a frayed scrap of rope she had cut away. "Keep that for practice," she said. "Learn to splice. Learn to count knots." Her words were instruction and a small offer of hope. Tom agreed. He practiced in the afternoon while Peter and Isaac mended a shutter for Mrs. Halloway. The neighborhood's noise became a pattern of small repairs and barter. People exchanged bread for stitches, sugar for a night of watch. The foreman returned in the dusk with tar and a new coil of rope. He set the coil on the yard stones and looked at Tom and then at the group. "I will ensure it is safe from now on," he said. Greta watched him and then looked away. She did not accept the foreman's words at face value, but she also did not make a scene. Instead, she organized a schedule so that someone would inspect the rope each morning. Mrs. Halloway wrote names on the slate and assigned shifts. The foreman, pressed by public tally and the burned rope, signed one of the names. Tom slept that night in a proper bed because Mrs. Halloway insisted he take one of her spare quilts. He woke before dawn and pressed his hands together until the last sleep rubbed off. He thought of the flu, the frayed rope, and the wicker trap that had saved him. He remembered the pain in his hip and the small coins that had risen into his palm. When he returned to the yard the next morning, Greta was already checking the splice and humming a tune she used to hum when she set traps. Mrs. Halloway stood with her slate. Peter sharpened a spike. The foreman watched from the lane and recorded names. The alley smelled of damp rope and soap. They had not overturned the system that made children trade sleep for wages. But they had made it marginally less dangerous for a day, and in that small change the neighborhood found a fragile order. Tom's choice had not been heroic. It had been pragmatic and worn by hunger. Yet the way he accepted help, learned to splice rope, and began to plan for small additional work made a kind of quiet resolution, a life adjusted by small, deliberate acts. There was a final, concrete beat to end the chapter. As the group dispersed, Mrs. Halloway slipped a sealed envelope into Tom's hand. He opened it once he stepped into the yard and found a folded piece of paper with a small list. 2 names and the notation "sweep when free" and a coin taped to the corner.
Mrs.
Halloway had written her name at the top and added a note. "Ask Mr. Brewer for odd jobs on Saturdays." Tom looked up and met her eyes. He nodded. He would go. The knot in his chest loosened into a practical plan. Greta patted his shoulder. "Tomorrow we teach you to splice clean every time," she said. He folded the list and tucked it away, the paper thin and precise as a tool. The repaired rope sighed once in the wind above them, taut and new. The foreman counted names and walked away with tools balanced on his arm. Mrs. Halloway took up her slate and began to add a new column for inspections. The alley pulsed in small motions. Someone sweeping, someone cooking, someone sewing a stitch with urgent hands. This closed the day's conflict not with a speech but with action. Repairs, a borrowed bed, and a written plan. Tom accepted the coin he had earned and set his jaw to the next day's tasks. Greta tightened the last knot and handed him the end of the spare rope to practice on. Peter carried the excess coil toward the lumberyard. The foreman promised to bring tar. The slate held names and the beginnings of accountability. Tom walked away with the list in his pocket and a stitch of resolve that was practical rather than rusing. The neighborhood had altered the ledger of harm into a short line of repair. That change would not erase the dangers the block would see again, but it had shifted who counted and where accountability might be asked. He paused at the gate and turned once to look at the yard. Rope taut, lanterns guttering, neighbors talking low about work and supper. Greta caught his eye and gave him a brief, approving nod. Mrs. Halloway wiped her hands on her apron and marked a name on the slate. Peter waved from the alley, and Isaac hoisted a plank onto his shoulder. Tom stepped into the lane and felt the bruise warm with blood and the knowledge that he had not been rescued by luck alone. He had been pulled by a hand he trusted, by faces that kept accounts in charcoal and slate, and by decisions made in the yard. The repaired rope, the signed promise, and Mrs. Halloway's envelope were the day's concrete outcomes. He folded the list again and shoved it into his shirt, where it would not fall out as he climbed chimneys that afternoon. When he reached the next roof, the lamp light was low and the ropes swung steady under his feet. He set his cap and checked his knots with fingers that now knew how to feel a splice. He did not sleep on the line that day. He climbed, worked, and returned with a coin clinked in his palm and the expectation that tomorrow he would try to earn another coin with cleaner risks and a steadier plan. The alley kept its small noises. The repaired splice waited to be tested another day. The foreman walked the lane counting names. Greta sharpened her tools. "Mrs. Halloway wrote a new entry on the slate and closed the ledger with a steady hand. The story ended, concretely, with Tom stepping down from the roof and the soft, practical knot of a neighborhood that had done what it could. Emotion root. Fear shifted through anger and into guarded resolve through concrete actions and exchanges. The rope was fixed, promises were noted, and Tom left with both a coin and a plan stapled to a scrap of paper that smelled faintly of tar and starch.